Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm Kate Andrews, the Spectator's economics editor, and I'm joined by Paul Johnson, director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Paul, welcome to the show. So the general election campaign is nearly at an end. We've had the pledges, we've had the manifestos, we've had the gaffes, and I'm sure we'll have a few more. And I was thinking that the Institute for Fiscal Studies holds a very interesting place in an election because we don't have the Office for Budget Responsibility looking at these manifestos. We have independent forecasters that are truly outside of the government realm, looking at what different political parties are proposing. And some of the comments that you've made in this general election have been rather striking, looking at some of these policies. No sense was a catchphrase, meaningless. Conspiracy of silence is the big one that's really jumped out at me from the IFS. What's going on?
You tell me. Look, I mean, the points we're really trying to make are that the manifestos have got very little in them, and actually particularly the Labour manifesto in a sense, in that if you look at the costings numbers at the end, there's a very small number of very small numbers. And you've got promises of an extra couple of billion for health and some extra money for breakfast clubs and those sorts of things, and some small amounts of money raised from private school fees or what have you. Now, those are each individually, I mean, you might think those are fine, but they're not telling you anything essentially about the direction of travel even. So the constraints that we've got, as we all know, is that the Office of Budget Responsibility back in March said, with quite optimistic growth forecasts, that with 1% a year spending rises, which is what the government suggested, that would mean cuts for a whole range of departments. And even then, you're only just meeting the fiscal targets that both parties seem to be absolutely firmly tied to, which is that debt should be falling in the fifth year of the Parliament. So what do we mean by a conspiracy of silence? We mean, well, neither party's talking about that. Genuinely, we don't know how they would introduce spending cuts if they had to, whether they would increase taxes if they had to avoid spending cuts, or what the priorities would be within a very tight spending budget. Now, there's all sorts of reasons for all of that. We've got very, very high levels of debt interest spending. Defence spending is rising for the first time in decades. We've got health spending, of course, going up, demographic change, effectively. So it's a really difficult moment, but we're not really getting, I think, a serious discussion of how those difficulties will actually be addressed in practice.
I mean, we have no idea at all. We are in the last moments of the general election campaign, and they really won't talk about it at all. We're looking at, what, a £20 billion black hole, basically, for departmental spending over the next Parliament?
Well, possibly. I mean, it is worth saying that in some ways 20 billion in this context is an extremely small number, because this is looking at the cuts that might be needed 5 years out, given the forecast that we got in March. And it wouldn't take much in the forecast to shift those numbers in either direction. And I suppose, I hope that I'm shown to be a complete idiot in all of this, that actually the forecasts get a lot better, and they really might get a lot better.
And by forecast, you mean growth forecast?
The growth forecast.
The idea we're just going to grow away out of it.
Not necessarily because of anything the next government does, just because the economy turns up. The world economy might turn up. We've been growing very badly for a very long time. Things happen. And actually, there are some positive signs out there. So I hope all of my warnings turn out to be absolute nonsense. But it's just as likely that the forecast will go down as that they will go up. That actually the Office of Budget Responsibility, which is the forecast on which all of these decisions will have to get made, and Rachel Reeves has been very clear that she's going to be absolutely taking the OBR numbers as gospel. It's just as likely they go down as up. They might stay very much the same. And in that world, what actually would the new government do? And that's my frustration, is actually genuinely I don't know. I genuinely don't know.
Let's start with the Labour manifesto and then move on to the Tory one. Just looking at the polls, I'm going to start with Labour. I think that's a reasonable thing to do. Do you see anything where you go, aha, that's how they're filling the gap? That's how they're going to grow the economy? Well,
I mean, first of all, I'd say to a degree, I'm something of an optimist on governments being able to make a difference to growth over the long term. And I think the long term is important here, that you can't sustainably change growth within a year or two, but within 5 to 10 years, maybe you can. And we kind of broadly know how to do it. So we'll come on to planning change in a moment, because that seems to be central to what Labour is saying. I think that is serious, and I think you can make a difference with that. Actually, simply having a stable, non-chaotic government for a period of time would help, and maybe we'll get that, because without making a political point, since 2016 we haven't really had that, and that's not good for
shaky
investment. It has been shaky at best. I think is a kind way of describing it. Investment in infrastructure, broadly speaking, tax reform we know would help. A closer trading relationship with the European Union we know would help. Better education policy we know would help. So all of those things we know, broadly speaking, would help. So what's in the Labour manifesto? I think there's three places to look at. There are some things that just aren't there. So there's nothing, for example, on tax reform. There's almost nothing on closer relationships with the European Union. So that immediately tells you there are some things which appear to be beyond the pale, even when it comes to growth. It's also the case that actually, as far as one can tell from that manifesto, investment spending will fall. Not quite as fast as the Conservatives are proposing investment spending to fall, but nevertheless, the numbers suggest that they're going to cut government capital spending, which is bad for growth in the long run, at least if it's good capital spending. We've had quite a lot of bad capital spending as well. But we've also, so there's things that aren't there. Then there are the sort of lots of talks about industrial strategies, Great British Energy, wealth funds, all of those sorts of things. I don't know how effective those things are likely to be. They suggest quite a lot of confidence in the capacity of government to get those things right, and maybe they will, and with a good, stable, long-term strategy that might have a positive effect, but I'm pretty neutral, frankly, on how likely that is. And then there's what I think is the most hopeful set of issues in there, in particular, what appears to be a determination to really make a big difference to the planning rules. Now, that's difficult. Yeah. But I certainly believe that our planning system is a significant problem for our growth. Now, that probably means taking an awful lot of power away from local authorities and simply, as Keir Starmer has almost said, simply ramming through whole new towns or infrastructure where the local people really don't want it. Now, that would be politically
on the grey belt.
Politically brave, but I think that can make a difference. Now, as I say, there are lots of other things. There is some stuff in there on education, but there's not very much. I think we'll have to wait to see. There's lots of suggestions of strategies and reviews and so on, and that might have an impact on growth. So I'm hopeful, but I don't think there's a lot of detail there.
There's very little detail, but there are really big promises around NHS reform and building new hospitals and getting rid of the waiting lists that go over 18 weeks. This stuff requires money. Labour keeps insisting everything in its manifesto it has already costed by the tax rises it has already announced. We know, because a document was leaked to The Guardian, that Labour are optioning potential other tax hikes. But then there are big questions around what might not be considered a tax hike on paper, but could certainly act like one if you start talking about a cap on ISAs of £100,000. There's been a lot of whispers about that. The Shadow Work and Pension Secretary, Liz Kendall, has refused to rule out changes to the 25% tax-free allowance on pensions. They're considering a heck of a lot of stuff that they're not talking about in this election. We're not getting a lot of transparency on that point. What do you make of that? It makes your job very difficult at the IFS, because you're being asked, is this costed? Does this add up? But with such little detail in it, who can really tell if in a couple months' time everything's going to add up?
Well, I think there's three separate points there. I mean, there's one about the costing of things like health spending, and this is where I think both Labour and Tory manifestos just don't tell us anything. I mean, so I think Labour has costed £2 billion worth of additional spending on the NHS. I mean, that is as near to zero as makes no difference in the context of a £200 billion public service, which we know will involve 30, 40, 50 billion a year more spending by the end of the Parliament than it does now, just if it goes up in line with how it's always gone up. And both parties say they're committed to the NHS workforce plan. This is a vast and unbelievably expensive plan.
Hugely expensive plan.
And Labour has also said they want to get nobody waiting more than 18 weeks. Now, they achieved that under the last Labour government, but they achieved that with 7% a year increases for about 7 years in terms of spending. They haven't got close to that kind of scope.
They haven't committed to that in the manifesto.
No, absolutely not. So my point here is that sort of the idea that this is costed because they say they've got £2 billion to spend is meaningless. That's the word I've used to describe that.
And this is the conspiracy of silence. This is just what we're not talking about.
Conspiracy of silence. So I think I think it's hard to think. And look, I absolutely don't think the parties should be laying out. This is what we'll spend in 4 years' time on each of these public services. Of course they can't, but they can give us some sense of their priorities between tax and spend, their priorities within spending, how they might respond if the economy goes well, how they might respond if the economy goes badly. Maybe that's asking too much, but that's the sort of thing which gives us just even what some people say. They sort of suggest the IFS worries too much about costing, but actually I'm just trying to get broad sense of direction here, and I think. And
have you got that from any of the parties? Would you say?
Not really. No. Not really. I mean, you sort of do from the smaller parties, but in such implausible ways,
right?
That's almost completely meaningless. But your point about tax change is really important. Now, you mentioned a range of possible tax changes, some of which I thought, Christ, that's stupid, and some of which I thought, yes, actually, you could do that. So you could get quite a lot of money from changing pension tax. And there are sensible ways of doing that, and there are much less sensible ways of doing that. The sorts of things people often talk about are reduce the upfront income tax relief. Now, I think that would get you a lot of money, but I think it would be a very bad way of doing it, because that would really involve double taxation of pensions, essentially. But there are a lot of tax relief of pensions which are much too generous. I mean, you can leave your pension pot inheritance tax-free. That's balmy, in my view. I actually think that being able to get £250,000 income tax-free as a lump sum is excessively generous. The way we treat pensions for national insurance contributions are excessively generous. So there are things that you could and possibly should do on pensions, and there are other things you shouldn't do. From an economist's point of view, actually the way we treat pensions broadly and ISA is quite sensible. So you have you pay tax once and then you don't pay tax again. So I wouldn't be particularly in favour of limiting that. It wouldn't get you an enormous amount of money. Anyway, capital gains tax, there's loads we could do to capital gains tax to make it better.
To your point about direction of travel, the way the Labour Party are talking about their manifesto currently, when they talk about it, it's as if you should not expect anything else to be announced. What is in that manifesto is what's coming. In the Sky News debate with Beth Rigby, she was really pushing Keir Starmer on capital gains tax. And he kind of threw his hands up at one point and was like, it's not going to be in the manifesto, as if this is a ludicrous question. Why are you asking me about this? We're not hiking these taxes. It's not in the manifesto at all, and everything that isn't in the manifesto is on the table. To your point about the direction of travel, these are the questions that remain completely outstanding, even though we're at the end of the campaign.
I think that's always been true, to be fair. So, history may not be a guide to the future, but historically, budgets immediately after elections, particularly when you're changing the party in power, tend to involve quite big tax increases. And that was true in 2010. So a big increase in VAT and national insurance contributions was not in the Conservative Party manifesto, but that happened almost immediately. 1979, a big increase in VAT and a big cut in income tax was not part of the Conservative manifesto then, but it happened after the 2001 election. An increase in national insurance wasn't in the Labour manifesto, but it happened. So there's plenty of historical precedent for let's get the difficult things out of the way in the budget before an election. Actually, again, if you look over a long period of time, budgets immediately before elections tend to have tax cuts, as the most recent one did. So, this is not a prediction, and the past, as they say, is not necessarily a guide to the future. But if you were to use the past as a guide to the future, then you might expect some tax rises. So it's also worth saying, of course, the other thing neither party want to talk about is they are both committed to a £10 billion tax rise, which is another 3 years of freezing income tax and national insurance allowances
Yeah.
and thresholds. Now, they are both committed to that, but are they talking about it? Well, not surprisingly, no, they're not.
Well, the Tories, let's move on to them, keep saying that they are cutting taxes. They've proposed £17 billion worth of tax cuts. That does not offset the freeze to tax thresholds and the income that they will get from that, which is perhaps why that argument has never landed. They insist that the bulk of this is going to be funded by cracking down on welfare benefits, £12 billion of savings there. You said, forgive a degree of skepticism.
One thing it is worth saying that, to quote a phrase, this Tory government has really hiked up taxes on people on high incomes and actually done an extraordinary job of cutting taxes for people on average earnings. And they've increased taxes for pensioners and cut them for people of working age. Now, that is not part of the narrative, but it's very, very clear in the figures and what's happened.
Why haven't they made that part of the narrative?
I don't know. I think it's quite... I suppose it's sort of so countercultural to think that that's what the Conservative government might have done.
I think it'd be fair to say that if you stop somebody in the street and laid that out, I think the immediate reaction would be like, that can't be true. It just doesn't fit with the current narrative.
Yeah.
But the data backs it up.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, the political statements, they seem to have lost the narrative. I mean, they've also massively increased the amount of revenue we get from corporation tax. Now, I never thought I would say this, but we're getting more from corporation tax today than I think we have ever got in a world where 20 years ago, lots of us were worried about, international competition driving the amount down and down. So it's quite a surprising fact that tax revenues as a whole are at very high levels, but from someone on average earnings, the direct tax burden, Jeremy Hunt said this, and we checked it, and it's true, the direct tax burden is lower than it's been for 50 years for someone on average earnings. So that in a sense is quite surprising. Now, looking forward, they're suggesting more cuts to national insurance, and they've spent 20 billion on cuts to national insurance over the last year. I mean, one of the things that is quite striking about Labour is they're not saying they're going to reimpose that national insurance cut. They're not going to bring national insurance back to where it was. If they were to, that would give them quite a lot of additional room for manoeuvre. I think the Conservatives are right to identify that we have had a massive increase in spending on disability benefits and health-related benefits over the last few years. And one of my colleagues produced an astonishing graph for our manifesto analysis a couple of days ago, which shows that for every other bit of working age welfare over the last 15 years, there's been a small reduction in spending, and there's been a huge increase in spending on health-related benefits. So to want to tackle that, you can absolutely understand, but it's a really hard thing to tackle, both sort of technically and politically. And certainly for disability benefits, I can't think of a time when a government has actually successfully managed to bring that spending down.
This is all very concerning. And again, to go back to our theme here of the conspiracy of silence, you've been deeply disappointed, it seems, in the party's unwillingness to talk about how they're going to realistically fund even day-to-day spending over the next 5 years. We have not even begun to touch what's realistically happening to the NHS, to the state pension, to benefits over the next 20 to 30 years. What happens if you don't get millions of working age people back into work? What happens as aging demographics completely transform the NHS even further, to the point where you just have fewer and fewer people paying into a system to prop up older age care? I mean, these are the questions that I think are fundamental to the health of not just the UK. These are issues that every Western country is grappling with. And nobody wants to talk about. They can only be ignored for so long. And I think even in the past couple of years, with some of these shakes and wobbles we've seen, we can see a system that is at the brink, it is creaking, and we don't know how we're getting through the next 5 years, let alone the next 50.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because it speaks to the fact that, however miserabilist I might sound about the next 5 years, these are not challenges that are going to go away, and in fact they're going to get harder.
Even more miserable about the next 50.
They're going to get harder over time because of exactly what you're describing. We've got demographic change, pressure on health, social care, pensions is only going to go in one direction.
Yeah.
And we're not going to be able to do what we've done for the last 70 years, which is pay for some of that by cutting defence spending, and indeed by, as we did in the 2010s, by cutting pretty much everything else. Which is one of the reasons why, in a sense, the genie's popped out of the bottle over the last 5 years with this big increase in tax and spend. So there are exactly the challenges that you describe.
This is politically impossible to say to people on the one hand, look, in order to keep doing what we're doing, I'm going to have to keep raising taxes. But on the other hand, the bigger conversation we have to have is that very likely over the next 20 to 30 years, the state's actually going to need to do less. Or we're going to have to figure out a completely different system because this is not sustainable. To say to people on the one hand, we need more money, and also realistically to 20, 30, 40-year-olds, I'm not going to promise you you're going to get the state pension as it exists now. I'm not promising you you're going to get the same safety net or level of benefits that exists now for those in their 80s and 90s. Maybe that's why they're not talking very much.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's a saying in there's all us boring tax people: don't tax you, don't tax me, tax that fellow behind the tree, which is a sort of kind of how it always works. You get it from avoidance and evasion, get it from the super rich, get it from big companies. And again, if you look at Western Europe, I'm not saying we should emulate them, but all of those countries that have significantly higher tax burdens than we do get loads more from people on average, slightly above average kinds of income.
Let me quickly ask you about reform. They're pledging £90 billion worth of tax cuts, £50 billion, I think, worth of spending rises. I think you've described this as unhelpful.
I think that was me being very generous. Look, I mean, they are talking about the most extraordinarily huge tax cuts, and indeed their estimates are significant underestimates of what they're suggesting would actually cost. So they're looking at more than £100 billion of tax cuts, and they're then saying, and we'd find an extra 50 billion for health or whatever it is, and we pay for most of that through some entirely unspecified cuts to government waste and welfare. I think there is space for a party, a government, to say, look, we want a significantly smaller state, and that is at face value what Reform are selling. But then they have to tell us how they're going to get that smaller state. Is this means testing the state pension? Is it significantly privatising part of the NHS? Is it something else that saves you? Is it really slashing benefits for the poorest people of working age? I mean, it's that scale of change that you'd have to make in order to save the kind of scale of money, or is it abolishing the defence budget entirely? I mean, it really is on that scale. If you want a smaller state, then tell us how you're going to get it. Don't say, oh, we'll find 150 billion of government waste.
There's been some whispering about the idea that Labour might have an easier time in government borrowing money than the Tories have, especially the past couple of years. I don't really know where this has come from, but there's been some speculation that actually the international markets will relax a little bit. They'll see what Labour is trying to do. To be very clear, the Labour Party has not been saying this, but the fact that already there's some speculation, oh, maybe it would be a bit easier for Labour to borrow for investment. Do we not just go down the same road we went down a couple of years ago?
I think people can slightly overinterpret what happened in September 2022. I mean, because there was a lot of things going on at the same time. There was this big tax cut, 45 billion, with no indication of how that would be paid for.
But there was a plan to ask markets to fund £100 billion worth of an energy price guarantee. I was going to say that as well. Exactly. So there was that, and there was a big. We spent more on our energy support than I think any other country, so huge spending on that. And at the same time, the OBR was sidelined. And at the same time, you had the Chancellor going on telly that weekend saying, and we're going to do more. Yeah. A lot went on at the same time there. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, if you got a new government, which has, they've done a lot to give themselves fiscal credibility with the way that they've talked over the last period. In a world in which, supposing Rachel Reeves were to say in the first budget, look, I've discussed this with the markets, I've discussed this with my Treasury team, rather than getting debt falling in 5 years' time, I'm actually happy with debt rising by, let's say, 5 percentage points of national income. So by about, what's that, 125 billion, 130 billion pounds or something over that period. Because I've inherited such a goddamn mess, such an awful mess. I'm absolutely committed to getting debt down after that.
and most of that extra money is going to go on investment to get growth going. Would the markets go bonkers? I don't think so.
Really? Interesting.
I could be wrong. Would that be the right thing to do? Well, it is risky, not least because we don't know exactly how the markets would respond. Probably would increase interest rates a little bit. And we know that one of the big problems facing us right now is that we're spending a record amount on debt interest payments.
Right.
And so we are actually reaping the costs of our high levels of debt at the moment. And I think this is evidence that this was never a free lunch, and that the cost, the cost wasn't felt at the moment it was being borrowed, but it's being felt now. One of the big political challenges of the next few years is, if we really do want to get debt on a downward path, then we're going to have to run a primary surplus, which means government takes more from us than it gives back in anything other than debt interest. Well, we've very rarely done that in the past.
What do you make of the Tories' claim that Labour is going to raise your tax by £2,000? And what do you make of Labour's claim that under the Tories your mortgage is going to go up by almost £5,000?
I would suggest that voters entirely ignore all of those sorts of numbers and calculations. I think they're broadly they're broadly fictional. I don't have a clue what will. I mean, part of the issue is we don't know what would happen under these different governments, because they really haven't told us.
If you were anyone else other than a political party during a campaign, if you were a company and you were advertising something like this, or you were saying something like this, the Advertising Standards Authority would be knocking on your door immediately.
Well, we saw this in the Brexit campaign, didn't we?
But there is an interesting exemption here in which political parties really can sling these numbers about, and the IFS can check them. And, our editor here at the Spectator, Fraser Nelson, did a calculation of that £2,000 line from the Tories and said, using these calculations, the Tories will increase your tax by £3,000. So let's not totally buy into this. But does there need to be some kind of code of conduct, maybe set by the IFS, maybe set by somebody else, in which you just say, look, there has to be a scope in which we use numbers in a campaign, because there isn't anybody right now to call you out on it in a way that you would be if you were a business making false claims with advertising. Because, these numbers land.
Well, the UK Stats Authority did call some of these out. I mean, in particular, the 2000 number. No one would realise that this was accumulated over 4 or 5 years. It's not £2,000 a year.
But they get to keep using it.
But nevertheless, I don't know how you would stop them using it, other than sort of going and arresting them.
I think it's really more of a question of integrity, more of a question of a code of conduct. Would you like to see something a little more robust from political parties at the IFS?
It's been always, it really has been always the same. 1992, there was lots of stuff about how if you vote for Labour, everything will be a complete catastrophe. And that was really about tax and the suggestion that taxes would go up immensely. And again, it's an interesting historical comparison, because in the Norman Lamont, in the budget before the 1992 election, I'm sorry to any viewers who are not as old as I am, and indeed Kate, who's definitely not as old as I am.
I'm loving it. Keep going.
In the budget before the 1992 election, Norman Lamont cut taxes quite aggressively, and in the budget straight afterwards, he raised them enormously. And in his memoirs, he says that the first of those budgets was his worst economically and best politically, and the second was his best economically and worst politically. And therein, I think, lies exactly the problem we're facing.
They're all being very misleading, Paul. They're all being very misleading.
For reasons that I completely understand politically, we are not getting a very kind of honest prospectus about how tough it's all going to be.
Well, that'll be your job in the next Parliament, and that'll be our job. Paul, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV.